The night Julian Whitmore left, Lillian Moore was 7 months pregnant and standing barefoot on the cold kitchen floor, holding a phone that had just gone silent. No goodbye, no explanation. Just one message that burned into her memory like a scar. Don't contact me again. This is over. Outside, Manhattan was drowning in rain. Yellow cab lights blurred through the window, and somewhere below, people hurried home to warmth that no longer existed for her. Lillian lowered herself into a chair slowly, one hand on her stomach, the other still gripping her phone as if it might suddenly ring and undo everything. It didn't. An hour earlier, Julian had kissed her forehead and said he was late for a meeting. He wore his tailored coat, his expensive watch, the same calm expression he always had when life bent in his favor. She had believed him. She always did. Now the apartment felt hollow. The credit card on the counter no longer worked. Her shared bank app showed a balance that had dropped to 0. When she tried calling again, the screen flashed a word that made her chest tighten. Blocked. Lillian slid down against the cabinet, breathing through a sharp pain that wasn't just emotional. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing danger. "It's okay," she whispered, though nothing was okay anymore. She had no parents to call, no siblings, no safety net. She had aged out of foster care years ago, with nothing but a suitcase and a promise to herself that she would never beg. She remembered Julian's voice weeks earlier, warm and confident, telling her they would handle everything quietly. That his investors didn't need distractions. That love sometimes meant sacrifice. She hadn't realized then that she was the sacrifice. The rain grew heavier. Somewhere in the city, Julian was already rewriting his life, erasing her existence like a mistake on a clean page. Lillian pushed herself up and reached for her coat, dizzy and terrified but forced to move. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't collapse. Not now. As she opened the door, another wave of pain hit, stronger this time. Her breath caught, the baby moved again. And in that moment, Lillian understood something with chilling clarity. Julian hadn't just left her. He had abandoned a child who would one day stand right in front of him and look back with eyes he could never forget. By the time Lillian reached the street, the rain had soaked through her coat and chilled her skin. But it was the silence that hurt the most. Manhattan never slept, yet that night it felt like the city had turned its back on her too. She stood under a flickering streetlight, one hand pressed against her belly, trying to steady her breathing as another wave of pain rolled through her body. She hailed a cab with trembling fingers. When she gave the address of the nearest public hospital, the driver glanced at her through the mirror, noticing her pale face and swollen stomach. "You okay, miss?" he asked. Lillian nodded, though her lips were already numb. Inside the cab, she checked her phone again. No missed calls, no messages. Julian's name sat at the top of her contacts, useless now. She opened their shared photo album without thinking, smiling selfies. A quiet courthouse wedding photo they had promised to redo properly one day. His arm around her waist, protective, proud. Her chest tightened as she realized how carefully he had planned this disappearance. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights were harsh and unforgiving. A nurse asked for her insurance card. Lillian handed it over, already knowing the answer. The nurse typed, frowned, then typed again. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "This policy was canceled yesterday." Yesterday. Julian hadn't just left. He had prepared. Lillian swallowed her shame and signed the forms for emergency care. When the nurse asked for an emergency contact, her pen hovered over the paper. She left the line blank. The nurse didn't ask again. She had seen this before. Hours passed slowly. The contractions eased, but the fear didn't. Lillian sat alone in a plastic chair, listening to distant footsteps and the occasional cry of a newborn. Each sound felt like a reminder of what she was about to face alone. At some point near dawn, her phone buzzed. Her heart jumped, foolish hope flaring despite everything. The message wasn't from Julian. It was from an unknown number. "This is Mr. Whitmore's legal representative. He requests that you stop contacting him immediately. Any further attempts may be considered harassment." That was it. No concern for her condition, no mention of the child, just a threat wrapped in polite language. Lillian's hands shook as she locked her phone. Something inside her cracked, then hardened. She realized then that waiting for Julian to come back would destroy her faster than being abandoned ever could. When she was discharged later that morning, the rain had stopped. The city looked cleaner, almost indifferent, as if nothing terrible had happened overnight. Lillian stepped outside with a small envelope of paperwork and a heavier truth in her chest. She had lost her home that night, her marriage, her safety, but she had not lost her child. As she walked slowly down the sidewalk, surrounded by strangers who would never know her name, Lillian made a quiet decision. She would survive this. Not because she was strong, but because her child would need her to be. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the anger, a promise took shape. One day, Julian Whitmore would be forced to see what he had walked away from. By the third night, after leaving the hospital, Lillian Moore had nowhere left to go. The apartment Julian rented was locked. Her key no longer worked, and the building manager, avoiding her eyes, told her the lease had been terminated, per the owner's request. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply turned away, one hand gripping her bag, the other resting protectively over her stomach. She spent that night sitting on a bench near Central Park, wrapped in her coat, listening to the distant hum of traffic. The city lights shimmered through her tired eyes. She was exhausted, nauseous, and terrified that another contraction might start with no help around. Every instinct told her to keep moving, but her body refused. That was when a voice broke through the noise. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't be out here like this." Lillian looked up, startled. A woman in her early 40s stood a few feet away, holding a paper cup of coffee. She wore a simple coat, her hair pulled back, her expression calm but alert. She didn't look dangerous. She didn't look curious either. Just concerned. "I'm fine," Lillian said automatically, though her voice betrayed her. The woman studied her for a moment, taking in the swollen belly, the pale face, the way Lillian tried to sit straighter than she felt. "No," she said gently, "you're not." She introduced herself as Margaret Hale, the owner of a small cafe bookshop across the street. She said she closed late and hated seeing anyone alone in the cold. She didn't ask why Lillian was there. She didn't ask about the father. She only asked one thing. "Do you need somewhere warm to sit?" Something in Lillian finally gave way. She nodded. Margaret walked her across the street to the cafe, locked the door behind them, and turned on the lights. The space smelled like coffee and old books. It felt human. Margaret handed Lillian a chair and poured her tea without asking what she liked. When Lillian's hands started shaking, Margaret placed a folded blanket over her shoulders, calm and efficient, as if she had done this many times before. "You don't owe me a story," she said. "But you can rest." For the first time in days, Lillian cried. Quietly. No sobbing, no drama. Just tears sliding down as her body leaned forward, exhausted beyond words. Margaret sat across from her, saying nothing, simply staying. That night, Margaret offered Lillian the storage room upstairs. It was small, clean, and legal. "You can stay a few nights," she said. "We'll figure the rest out later." Those few nights turned into weeks. Lillian helped clean the cafe in exchange for the room. She organized inventory, learned the register, memorized schedules. She worked until her feet swelled, then worked a little more. Pride kept her upright. Fear kept her focused. One evening, Margaret handed her an old book with a cracked spine. Meditations, by Marcus Aurelius. "Read a page when things feel unbearable," she said. "It helps some people remember they're still standing." Only one. Late at night, alone in the small room, Lillian pressed the book to her chest and whispered promises to the life growing inside her. She didn't know how she would raise a child with nothing. She didn't know how she would survive. But she knew one thing. She had been abandoned once. She would not abandon herself. Labor began just after midnight. Lillian was folding clean towels in the cafe when the pain cut through her body so suddenly she had to grip the counter to stay upright. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Stress, exhaustion. She had learned to ignore pain these past weeks. But when it came again, sharper and lower, she knew the truth. She was out of time. Margaret found her minutes later, crouched on the floor, breathing hard. One look at Lillian's face and the soaked fabric beneath her dress was enough. Margaret didn't panic. She grabbed her coat, her keys, and wrapped Lillian in the thickest sweater she could find. "Stay with me," she said, steady and firm. "We're going to the hospital." The ride felt endless. Every streetlight flashed like a warning. Lillian clenched her jaw, counting breaths, whispering to the baby inside her. She had imagined this moment once. She had imagined Julian's hand in hers, his voice telling her she was doing great. The memory burned worse than the pain. At the hospital, the questions came fast. Name, age, insurance, emergency contact. I don't have one, Lillian said, her voice barely holding together. Margaret squeezed her hand. I'm here, she said. It wasn't the same, but it was something. Hours blurred together under bright lights. The pain took over everything else. When the nurse asked if the father was on his way, Lillian shook her head. Saying the words out loud felt like admitting defeat, but she didn't cry. She had no energy left for tears. The delivery was long and difficult. At one point, Lillian thought she might break apart completely. She screamed, then apologized for screaming. The nurse told her to stop apologizing. And then, suddenly, there was a cry. Sharp, alive, real. They placed the baby on her chest, small and warm and breathing. Lillian stared down at him, stunned by the force of what she felt. His eyes were closed, his tiny fingers curled instinctively against her skin. In that moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. I'm here, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere. She named him Ethan Moore. She didn't use Julian's last name. She didn't even consider it. Later, alone in the recovery room, Lillian held Ethan while the city woke up outside the window. Sunlight spilled across the floor. Somewhere far away, people were starting ordinary days, unaware that her life had split into before and after. A nurse brought paperwork and asked about the father again. Lillian hesitated, then shook her head. Unknown, she said quietly. Writing Julian's name felt like giving him something he didn't deserve. When she checked her phone, there were no messages, no missed calls, nothing. The silence confirmed what she already knew. Julian hadn't just missed the birth of his son. He had chosen not to be there. Margaret visited later that afternoon, holding a small stuffed bear and a bag of clean clothes. She smiled through tears when she saw Ethan. He's perfect, she said. Lillian nodded, exhaustion weighing down every limb. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Margaret looked at her carefully. You already are, she said. That night, after the nurses dimmed the lights, Lillian lay awake listening to her son breathe. Fear still lived in her chest. So did grief. But beneath it all was something new. A quiet, unshakable resolve. Whatever Julian had taken from her, he would never take this. And one day, whether he wanted to or not, he would have to face the truth she held in her arms. Lillian returned to the cafe 3 days after giving birth. Moving slowly, Ethan bundled against her chest. Margaret insisted she shouldn't rush back, but rent, food, and reality didn't wait for healing. Life had already taught Lillian that rest was a luxury she could not afford. The cafe was quiet that morning. Sunlight filtered through the windows, dust floating in the air like tiny reminders that time kept moving no matter what. Lillian settled into a chair near the back, rocking Ethan gently as he slept. For a brief moment, there was peace. It didn't last. Margaret entered, holding a thick white envelope, her expression darker than usual. This came for you, she said carefully. Delivered by courier. Not the mail. Lillian felt it before she opened it. Her hands tightened. Her chest grew tight. She knew exactly who it was from. Inside was a formal letter printed on expensive paper. It began with cold politeness. On behalf of Mr. Julian Whitmore, Lillian stopped reading halfway through the first paragraph. The message was clear enough. Julian denied paternity. He denied responsibility. He denied even knowing whether the child was his. The letter demanded that Lillian sign a legal statement agreeing never to contact him again, never to speak his name publicly, never to seek financial support. In exchange, there was an offer. A single payment, enough to disappear. Her vision blurred as she read the final line. Failure to comply may result in legal action. Margaret watched silently as Lillian folded the letter with trembling fingers. You don't have to do anything today, she said. Lillian shook her head. He's trying to erase us, she whispered. Like we were a mistake. That afternoon, Lillian sat alone in the small upstairs room, Ethan sleeping beside her. She stared at the letter for hours. The amount Julian offered could change everything. It could buy stability, safety, time. But it came with a price she couldn't accept. Her silence. That night, as she rocked Ethan, a knock came at the door. Margaret stepped aside to reveal a man in his early 40s. Calm, sharply observant, dressed simply. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't look like a savior either. "This is Henry Cole," Margaret said. "An old friend." Henry glanced at the letter on the table, then at Lillian. "You don't need to answer now," he said, "but you should know something." He explained carefully, slowly, never raising his voice. The letter Julian sent wasn't protection. It was fear. Julian was trying to control the narrative before it reached the wrong people. Investors, partners, anyone who might ask questions. "You have more rights than he wants you to believe," Henry said. "And more leverage." Lillian laughed weakly. "I have nothing." Henry met her eyes. "You have the truth," he said, "and a child the law will care about." For the first time since Julian left, Lillian felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but clarity. She picked up the letter again, then tore it cleanly in half. "I'm not disappearing," she said softly. "If he wants to erase us, he'll have to do it in the open." Henry nodded once. "Then we should prepare." Outside, the city lights flickered on as night fell. Somewhere across Manhattan, Julian Whitmore believed he had closed the door on his past. He had no idea he had just opened something far more dangerous. The first year after Ethan was born nearly broke Lillian. Sleep came in fragments. Her body healed slowly, and her mind even slower. Some nights, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the storage room, staring at the wall while Ethan slept, terrified by how close exhaustion felt to disappearing altogether. She learned quickly that strength was not loud. It was showing up again the next morning when every part of her wanted to collapse. Margaret adjusted the cafe's schedule so Lillian could work mornings only. In return, Lillian did everything. She cleaned, managed inventory, handled invoices, learned the register systems, and memorized supplier contacts. She worked with Ethan, strapped to her chest when she had to. No one complained. Most people didn't even ask. Henry Cole checked in quietly, never pushing. He helped her file basic paperwork for child benefits, explained her rights in simple language, and then stepped back. "You don't owe me trust," he told her once. "Earn it slowly." Money was always tight. Lillian learned how to stretch groceries, how to track every dollar, how to say no to herself so she could say yes to Ethan. When he turned 2, she bought him a used toy truck from a thrift store. He loved it like it was gold. Some nights were worse than others. Ethan would wake crying, reaching for a father he didn't understand, asking questions she couldn't yet answer. "Where is he?" he asked once. Small voice cutting straight through her chest. Lillian held him close. "He wasn't ready," she said carefully, "but you are loved, always." She never spoke Julian's name. By the 3rd year, things began to shift. Margaret officially promoted Lillian to operations manager. The cafe expanded its hours. Lillian negotiated better supplier terms, reduced waste, increased profit. She learned fast because failure wasn't an option. She studied at night on an old laptop, teaching herself accounting basics and scheduling software while Ethan slept beside her. People started to notice. Not Julian, not yet, but others. Henry began bringing her more responsibility, consulting her on logistics decisions for businesses she didn't even realize he was connected to. He never explained his background. He simply listened, respected her ideas, and treated her like someone whose mind mattered. The hardest part was the fear that never fully left. Every unknown number made her tense. Every official envelope sent her heart racing. Julian's shadow lingered in the background, silent but heavy. She knew he could resurface at any moment. She prepared for that day without letting it steal her peace. When Ethan turned 4, Lillian moved into a small apartment near Central Park. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. On the first night, Ethan ran from room to room, laughing, amazed by the space. "This is our home?" he asked. Lillian nodded, tears burning her eyes. "Yes, it is." End quote. She stood at the window later that night, watching the city lights, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Stability. Julian Whitmore had disappeared from her life 4 years ago, believing silence would bury the truth. What he didn't know was that while he was climbing higher, Lillian Moore was building something far more dangerous. A life that didn't need him. And a child who would one day look him in the eye and ask the question no amount of money could silence. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the cafe's door with the rest of the deliveries. Lillian almost missed it. It wasn't addressed to her by name, only to operations manager, printed in clean black letters on thick cream paper. She opened it absent-mindedly while balancing invoices and a half-cold cup of coffee. She froze halfway through the first sentence. A charity gala hosted by Whitmore Capital Partners. Her breath caught. The name sat there calmly, as if it had never destroyed anything, as if 4 years of silence hadn't passed, as if a child hadn't been born into the space Julian Whitmore left behind. Margaret noticed the color drain from Lillian's face. "What is it?" she asked. Lillian handed her the card without speaking. Margaret read it once, then again more slowly. "You don't have to go," she said immediately. Lillian knew that. But she also knew something else. The cafe had been selected as a specialty coffee vendor for the event. Declining wouldn't just affect her, it would hurt the business, the staff, the reputation they had spent years building. She had worked too hard to let fear make decisions for her. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Lillian sat alone at the small kitchen table, the invitations spread out in front of her. The location was unmistakable. A luxury hotel in Midtown Manhattan. The kind of place Julian belonged to now. The kind of place she had once imagined entering at his side. Ethan padded out of his room in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Mom?" he whispered. She lifted him into her lap, pressing her cheek against his hair. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I dreamed of a man," he said sleepily. "He looked like me." Lillian's heart skipped painfully. Children said strange things, innocent things, but the timing felt cruel. She tucked Ethan back into bed and returned to the table, hands shaking slightly. For the first time in years, Julian's world was opening a door right in front of her. Not because he wanted to see her, because he didn't even know she was there. Henry Cole called the next afternoon, as if he sensed the shift before she spoke a word. She told him about the gala. There was a pause on the line. "You don't need to face him," Henry said carefully. "I know," Lillian replied, "but I think I should. Not for revenge, not for confrontation. For something quieter, stronger, visibility." On the night of the gala, Lillian wore a simple black dress she already owned. No dramatic transformation, no borrowed confidence, just clean lines and steady hands. She braided Ethan's hair neatly and introduced him to the babysitter with a calm smile. When she arrived at the hotel, the lobby glowed with polished marble and soft music. Men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses. Power and money moving effortlessly through the room. And then she saw him. Julian Whitmore stood near the center, laughing lightly, a glass in his hand, looking exactly as he always had controlled, successful, untouched by consequence. For a moment, Lillian felt the past pull at her chest. Then she straightened. He hadn't erased her. He had simply failed to imagine she would still exist. As she stepped fully into the room, unnoticed and unafraid, one truth settled firmly inside her. This night wasn't about confronting Julian. It was about what would happen when he finally saw what he had abandoned standing calmly in plain sight. Julian Whitmore didn't notice Lillian at first. He was surrounded by laughter, by people who spoke in confident tones about markets, properties, and future deals. His posture was relaxed, his smile effortless. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who had never made a mistake that mattered. Lillian stood near the edge of the ballroom, observing quietly. She recognized the version of him he was showing the world. She had loved that version once. She also knew how carefully it had been constructed. The coffee station opened, and guests began lining up. Lillian moved naturally behind the counter, greeting people politely, focusing on the simple rhythm of work. Steam hissed, cups clinked, familiar motions steadied her breathing. Then it happened. A small voice drifted across the room. "Mom?" Julian turned at the sound. Ethan stood a few steps away from the counter, holding the babysitter's hand. She had brought him early by mistake, confused by the hotel's back entrance and the instructions. Ethan had slipped free the moment he saw Lillian. He ran toward her. Julian watched the child cross the floor, his attention snagged by something he couldn't immediately name. The boy's hair was dark, his posture confident despite his size. But it was the eyes that stopped Julian cold. Gray-blue, sharp, familiar. The room seemed to tilt. Julian's smile faded as Ethan reached the counter and wrapped his arms around Lillian's legs. "You said you'd be right here," he said, slightly out of breath. "I am," Lillian replied softly, crouching to his level. "I'm right here." Julian stared openly now, his glass forgotten in his hand. The chatter around him blurred into nothing. The child looked up again, curious gaze drifting past Lillian, straight to Julian. Their eyes met. For a single, suspended moment, no one else existed. Ethan studied Julian without fear, head tilted slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Julian felt his chest tighten violently. It was like looking into a mirror he hadn't known existed. Cassandra Vale appeared at Julian's side, following his gaze. "What are you staring at?" she asked lightly. Julian didn't answer. "That child," Cassandra continued, her voice lowering. "Is something wrong?" Lillian stood slowly, placing herself between Ethan and Julian without a word. Her body did it instinctively, protective, final. Julian found his voice at last. "Lillian," he said hoarsely. She looked at him then. Not with anger, not with longing, with distance. "Mr. Whitmore," she replied calmly. The formality cut deeper than any accusation. Cassandra's eyes flicked between them, sharp with calculation. "You know each other?" Julian swallowed. "We worked together. Years ago." Ethan tugged on Lillian's hand. "Mom, who's that man?" The question landed like a blow. Julian opened his mouth. Closed it. His mind raced, grasping at explanations that refused to form. The resemblance was undeniable, now that he saw it clearly. The tilt of the head. The shape of the mouth. Lillian answered before Julian could. "No one you need to worry about," she said gently to Ethan. "Go wait by the table, okay?" Ethan nodded and walked away. Julian watched him go, heart pounding, the world crashing back into place with unbearable clarity. 4 years of silence. 4 years of denial. And now, standing just a few feet away, was the proof he could never unsee. The child he had abandoned. And the truth he could no longer outrun. Julian didn't remember deciding to move. He only knew that his feet were carrying him after Lillian, past the soft music and polite conversations, down a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs of donors and smiling executives. His heart pounded so hard it made his vision blur. "Lillian," he called again, lower this time. "Please. I need to talk to you." She stopped, but she didn't turn around right away. When she did, her face was composed, almost unreadable. 4 years ago, he would have recognized every emotion in her eyes. Now, he couldn't find a single one. "You have 5 minutes," she said calmly. "I'm working." Julian exhaled sharply. "That child," he began, then faltered. "He looks like me." Lillian didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. She simply waited. "I didn't know," Julian said quickly. "You disappeared. You never told me." Her laugh was soft and humorless. "You blocked my number, you sent a lawyer, you canceled my insurance while I was pregnant." His face tightened. "I was under pressure. Investors. The board. A scandal would have ruined everything." "And a child wouldn't?" she asked. The words landed quietly, but they struck hard. Julian rubbed his forehead. "I can fix this," he said. "We can handle it privately. I can help financially, whatever you need." There it was. Money. Always money. "I don't need your help," Lillian replied. "I needed it 4 years ago." He looked at her more closely now. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't angry. That terrified him more than anything else. "What do you want?" he asked. "Nothing from you," she said. "But if you come near my son again without permission, my lawyer will be involved." "Lawyer?" Julian repeated, his pulse quickening. Before she could answer, Cassandra's voice cut in sharply. "Julian, the board is looking for you." Cassandra stood at the end of the hallway, eyes narrowed. She had seen enough to understand the danger. "What is this?" she demanded, glancing at Lillian. "Why is she here?" Julian hesitated. That hesitation told Cassandra everything. Her gaze snapped to Lillian, then back to Julian. "You said there was no one," she whispered. "No wife, no child." Lillian stepped forward, her voice steady. "I was your wife," she said. "Legally." Cassandra froze. "That's not possible." "It is," Lillian replied, "and so is he." The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. Julian's phone buzzed, then buzzed again. He glanced down and felt his stomach drop. Missed calls, messages. One subject line stood out. Urgent. Due diligence concern. Henry Cole stood at the far end of the hallway now, calm and unobtrusive, holding his phone. He met Julian's eyes and gave a slight nod. Nothing threatening, nothing dramatic. Just confirmation. Cassandra's voice dropped to a hiss. "What have you done?" she asked Julian. Lillian watched them both, realization settling in. This was no longer just about her. The lie Julian had built his life on was cracking, and it was happening in plain sight. "My 5 minutes are up," she said quietly. Julian reached out without thinking. She stepped back. As she walked away, Julian felt the weight of something final pressed down on him. For the first time since he had walked out 4 years ago, he understood the truth. He wasn't losing control of a situation. He was losing the story he had told the world about who he was. Julian stood frozen in the hallway long after Lillian disappeared into the crowd. Around him, the gala continued as if nothing had happened. Laughter rose and fell. Glasses clinked. Deals were whispered into corners. But inside Julian's chest, something had begun to cave in. Cassandra grabbed his arm, her nails digging in. "Who is she?" she demanded under her breath. "And don't lie to me again." Julian pulled free slowly. "Not here," he said. "We'll talk later." Her eyes hardened. There may not be a later. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom, already calculating damage control. Julian followed, forcing his face back into its practiced calm. But the moment he stepped into the light, his phone vibrated again. Another message. Another call. He glanced down and felt a cold wave of dread. The subject lines were no longer subtle. Compliance review. Ethics committee request. Clarification needed regarding marital status. Henry Cole hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. He had simply nudged the right doors open, and now the system Julian trusted so deeply was beginning to turn on him. Julian excused himself from a conversation and slipped into a quiet lounge, hands shaking as he scrolled. Someone had flagged inconsistencies between his public disclosures and private records. Marriage dates, tax filings, dependent status. Details he had buried carefully. Details that now refused to stay buried. Across the room, Lillian finished her shift with steady hands. She didn't look at Julian again. She focused on packing equipment, thanking staff, making sure everything was done properly. Her calm unsettled him more than any accusation could have. She was acting like a woman with nothing to hide. Julian realized then that she hadn't come to confront him. She had come because she wasn't afraid anymore. Cassandra cornered him near the exit. "Did you lie to the board?" she asked flatly. Julian hesitated. "That was enough. You said your past was clean," she continued. "You said there were no personal liabilities." "There was no reason for this to come out now," Julian snapped. "She planned this." Cassandra laughed once, sharp and bitter. "No," she said, "you did." She leaned in close. "If this becomes public, I'm not going down with you." She walked away without looking back. Julian watched her go, the weight of isolation settling heavily on his shoulders. For years, he had believed control meant silence, distance, and money. He was beginning to understand how fragile that illusion had been. Outside, Lillian stepped into the cool night air, relief washing over her. Her body trembled now that the adrenaline faded. Henry stood a short distance away, waiting. "It started," he said quietly. She nodded. "I know. You okay?" Lillian thought of Ethan, safe at home, of the life she had built piece by piece, of the man who had once held her hand and promised never to leave. "I am," she said honestly, for the first time in a long while. Inside the hotel, Julian Whitmore stared at his reflection in the mirror of the men's room. The man looking back still wore a tailored suit and an expensive watch. But the story holding it all together was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming next. That night, Lillian didn't sleep. She lay in the dark of her apartment, listening to Ethan's soft breathing from the next room, every small sound pulling her back to the surface of fear she thought she had learned to control. The gala was over, but its shadow stretched long and heavy across her chest. She replayed Julian's face over and over in her mind. Not angry, not cruel, terrified. That was new. At 2:17 a.m., her phone buzzed. She sat up instantly. Unknown number. Her pulse spiked, but she answered anyway. "Hello?" Silence. Then a woman's voice, calm and precise. "Miss Moore," the voice said. "This is a courtesy call." Lillian's grip tightened on the phone. "Courtesy for what?" "For your own protection," the woman replied. "You've attracted attention you don't fully understand." Lillian swung her legs out of bed, moving quietly toward Ethan's room. He slept peacefully, unaware of the world pressing in. "If this is about Julian Whitmore," she said, "you should speak to my lawyer." Everyone. A faint chuckle. "Oh, we know Mr. Whitmore is no longer in control. That's exactly the problem." The call ended. Lillian stood there, phone still pressed to her ear, heart racing. For the first time in years, real fear crawled back into her body. Not the fear of being poor, not the fear of being alone, the fear of being targeted. The next morning, Henry arrived early. One look at Lillian's face and he knew something had shifted. "They contacted you," he said. She nodded. "Not him. Someone else." Henry's expression hardened. "Julian's partners. When men like him start falling, others panic." "I don't want trouble," Lillian said quietly. "I just want my son safe." "And that," Henry replied, "is exactly why we move carefully now." Over the next few days, the pressure escalated. Anonymous emails, subtle threats disguised as concern. One message suggested that a public custody dispute could be very stressful for a child. Another implied that past medical records might resurface. They were testing her. Lillian felt the old weight return, pressing on her chest, whispering that she was too small for this fight, that she should take money, take silence, protect Ethan by disappearing. Then, she watched Ethan at breakfast, happily explaining his day at preschool, trusting the world without hesitation. Something inside her steadied. Henry laid everything out that afternoon. "They're trying to scare you into settling quietly. If you back down now, they win. Not just Julian, all of them." "And if I don't?" Lillian asked. Henry didn't sugarcoat it. "It gets public, messy, painful." Lillian thought of 4 years of quiet survival, of nights counting dollars, of learning to stand without leaning on anyone. "I've already lived through painful," she said. "I'm not afraid of it anymore." That evening, she tucked Ethan into bed, brushing his hair back gently. "Mom," he asked sleepily, "are you mad?" She smiled softly. "No, sweetheart, I'm brave." After he fell asleep, Lillian sat alone at the kitchen table and signed a document Henry had prepared. Not a settlement. A formal legal notice. The first official step toward the truth becoming impossible to bury. Somewhere across the city, powerful people were realizing that the woman they tried to erase wasn't running anymore. She was standing still, and waiting for the consequences to reach the men who deserved them. The legal notice landed like a quiet earthquake. It didn't explode on social media. It didn't reach the headlines. Instead, it moved through private channels, board emails, compliance inboxes, closed-door conversations where powerful people suddenly sat a little straighter in their chairs. Lillian never saw most of it. She only felt the shift. The calls stopped. The anonymous emails vanished overnight. The carefully worded threats disappeared as if they had never existed. Silence returned, but this time, it wasn't meant to erase her. It was the silence of people regrouping. Henry explained it plainly. "They didn't expect you to push back with facts," he said. "They expected fear." "What happens now?" Lillian asked. "Now," Henry replied, "they start checking everything." Julian Whitmore felt it first. 2 days after the gala, his access badge failed at the office turnstile. "A minor issue," the receptionist said politely. "An update. IT would fix it soon." But when he reached his floor, his assistant avoided his eyes. A meeting had been moved. Another postponed. By the end of the day, Julian received a formal request. Documentation clarifying his marital status over the last 6 years. He stared at the screen, pulse pounding. That evening, Cassandra Vale called him for the first time since the gala. Her voice was sharp, stripped of charm. "I'm hearing your disclosures don't match reality," she said. "You told me there was no paper trail." "There isn't," Julian snapped. "She has nothing." Cassandra paused. "Then, why are auditors asking about a sealed courthouse record?" Julian's blood ran cold. He hung up without answering. Meanwhile, Lillian prepared for a different kind of battle. Henry walked her through the process, step by step. DNA testing, custody protection, financial disclosures, nothing rushed, nothing sloppy. Every move, clean, measured, impossible to twist. "This isn't about revenge," Henry reminded her. "It's about control of the narrative." Lillian nodded. She understood that now. Truth didn't need volume, it needed structure. The DNA appointment was scheduled quietly, early in the morning. Lillian held Ethan's hand as they waited. He kicked his legs gently, curious but unafraid. "Is this a doctor?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "Just a checkup." He smiled. "Okay. Nexter. If you get some off." Lillian looked at her son and felt a surge of emotion so strong it almost knocked the breath from her chest. He trusted her completely. That trust was sacred. Across the city, Julian sat alone in his apartment, staring at old photos he had never deleted. Lillian laughing on a park bench, her hand resting on her stomach, a version of himself he barely recognized. His phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a notification. Preliminary review indicates material misrepresentation. Julian closed his eyes. Back at home, Lillian tucked Ethan into bed and sat beside him until his breathing evened out. The apartment was quiet, safe, solid. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only certainty. For years, Julian had controlled the story by deciding who mattered and who didn't. He had assumed silence meant victory. Now the truth was moving forward on its own, through systems he had once trusted to protect him. And Lillian Moore, the woman he believed he had erased, was no longer reacting to his choices. She was making her own. The next phase wouldn't be loud, but it would be final. The family court building didn't look like the place where lives were decided. It was quiet, almost forgettable, tucked between office blocks where people hurried past without knowing what happened inside. No cameras, no reporters, just polished floors, muted voices, and the weight of truth pressing down on everyone who entered. Lillian arrived early, holding Ethan's small hand. He wore a neat sweater and sneakers that lit up when he stepped. He smiled at the security guard, completely unaware of the meaning of the day. Henry walked beside them, calm as ever. "Remember," he said softly, "this is about protection, not punishment." Lillian nodded, her stomach twisted anyway. Julian arrived 10 minutes later, alone. He looked different, not ruined, not broken, but thinner somehow, as if something essential had already been taken from him. He avoided Lillian's eyes at first, then glanced down at Ethan and flinched. The resemblance was no longer deniable. Inside the courtroom, everything felt restrained. The judge spoke evenly. The clerk read names without emotion. This wasn't drama, this was consequence. Julian's attorney opened with confidence, emphasizing Julian's financial stability, his willingness to support the child, his concern for sudden disruptions to the boy's life. It sounded reasonable, polished, safe. Then Henry stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack. He laid out dates, documents, marriage records that had been quietly sealed and quietly altered, insurance cancellations timed to the pregnancy, legal letters demanding silence. Piece by piece, the story Julian had hidden came into the light. When the DNA results were presented, the room went still. A 99.99% match. Julian closed his eyes. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly, "you were aware of the likelihood of paternity." Julian hesitated. That hesitation echoed louder than any confession. "Yes," he said finally. The word landed hard. Lillian felt her chest tighten, not with victory, but with grief. Not for herself. For Ethan. For the years that could never be returned. The judge's ruling was firm and measured. Lillian retained full physical custody. Julian would have supervised visitation, conditional on counseling and compliance. Financial support would be established immediately, along with a protected education fund for Ethan. No applause, no gasps. Just the sound of a gavel sealing a new reality. Outside, Julian approached Lillian cautiously. "I never wanted to hurt him," he said, voice low. She looked at him steadily. "Intent doesn't erase impact," she replied. "You chose yourself. Now you live with that choice." Ethan tugged on her hand. "Mom, can we go get lunch?" "Yes," she said softly. "We can." As they walked away, Julian stood frozen, watching them go. For the first time, he wasn't being chased by consequences. He was being left behind by them. In the weeks that followed, news spread quietly through Julian's world. Partnerships paused. Invitations stopped arriving. No public scandal, no headlines, just doors that no longer opened. Meanwhile, Lillian returned to her routines. Work, school pickups, evenings at home. The world didn't suddenly become easy, but it became honest. One night, as she watched Ethan fall asleep, Lillian realized something profound. Justice hadn't come with fireworks. It had come with boundaries. And that was more powerful than anything Julian had ever controlled. Julian Whitmore thought the worst was over after court. He was wrong. The ruling didn't make headlines, but it traveled faster than gossip ever could. In Manhattan's financial circles, silence was louder than scandal. Meetings were rescheduled. Calls went unanswered. Smiles became polite, distant, careful. Within 2 weeks, Julian was asked to take a temporary leave from Whitmore Capital Partners. The phrase was gentle. The meaning was not. An internal review followed. Compliance, ethics, due diligence. Words Julian had once trusted as shields now turned into blades. His marriage, once hidden, was now classified as a material omission. His child, once denied, was a liability he had failed to disclose. Each finding stacked neatly on the next. At home, Cassandra Vale packed her things without ceremony. She moved through the apartment like a stranger, efficient and cold. "You told me you were clean," she said, folding a jacket. "I built my reputation on that." Julian didn't argue. He had no defense left. "You didn't just lie to me," Cassandra continued. "You made me complicit." She looked at him then, really looked, and shook her head. "Men like you always think silence is power. It's not. It's a delay." The door closed behind her with a final, echoing click. Julian sat alone in the quiet, staring at the walls he had once believed defined success. The watch on his wrist felt heavy now. Useless. Time no longer obeyed him. Across the city, Lillian felt the shift without celebrating it. Henry updated her carefully. "His partners are cutting exposure. Slowly. Cleanly." "I don't want revenge," Lillian said. "I know," Henry replied. "But accountability isn't revenge." At work, Lillian was offered something unexpected. Margaret sat her down one evening after closing. "I'm expanding," she said simply. "Another location. I want you to run operations. Fully." Lillian blinked. "Are you sure?" Margaret smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." The offer wasn't flashy. It wasn't charity. It was trust earned over years of showing up. Lillian accepted with quiet gratitude, feeling something solid settle beneath her feet. That night, she cooked dinner while Ethan colored at the table. "Mom," he said suddenly, "will I see him again?" Lillian paused. She chose her words carefully. "Yes," she said, "when it's safe, and when he learns how to be kind." Ethan nodded, satisfied. Children didn't need explanations wrapped in bitterness. They needed truth shaped gently. Weeks later, Julian attended his first supervised visit. He sat stiffly in the small room, unsure where to place his hands, his words failing him. Ethan studied him with open curiosity. "You look like me," Ethan said finally. Julian's throat tightened. "I do," he whispered. When the visit ended, Julian watched Ethan leave with Lillian, the distance between them final and enforced. For the first time, Julian understood that money could not buy trust back. That same evening, Lillian stood on her apartment balcony, city lights glowing below. Henry joined her, keeping a respectful distance. "You did this the right way," he said. Lillian exhaled slowly. "I just didn't run." Henry smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's enough." Behind them, the city moved on, and somewhere within it, a man who once believed he could erase consequences was learning what it meant to live with them, one quiet loss at a time. Julian made the call on a Sunday morning. Lillian recognized the number immediately, even though she hadn't saved it. Some memories didn't need labels. She stared at the screen until it stopped ringing, then went back to helping Ethan tie his shoes. A minute later, a message appeared. "Please, I just want to talk." One conversation. Lillian didn't respond. By the afternoon, Henry called instead. "He's requested a formal meeting," he said. "Through counsel, he wants to renegotiate." "Renegotiate what?" Lillian asked calmly. "Everything," Henry replied. "Support, visitation." Silence. There it was again. Silence. They met 2 days later in a quiet conference room downtown. Neutral ground, clean lines, glass table. Julian arrived early, suit pressed, posture controlled. He looked composed, but his eyes betrayed him. He was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. "Thank you for coming," he said when Lillian entered. She sat without returning the courtesy. "You asked for this." Julian nodded. "I want to make things right." Henry remained silent, watching. Julian slid a folder across the table. I'm prepared to offer a revised agreement, increased financial support, a private education fund, housing assistance if needed. He paused. And discretion. Lillian didn't open the folder. I've already accepted responsibility, Julian continued. But this has gone far enough. My career. She raised a hand gently. Stop. Julian froze. You don't get to frame this as generosity, Lillian said, her voice steady. You're offering money in exchange for comfort. Yours. Julian's jaw tightened. I'm trying to protect everyone. No, she replied. You're trying to stop the bleeding. Henry finally spoke. Any further attempt to condition support on silence would be viewed unfavorably. Julian leaned back, frustration cracking through his control. What do you want from me? Lillian met his gaze. Nothing personal. Only what the court ordered. And one more thing. He waited. You don't rewrite the story for Ethan, she said. You don't buy your way into his trust. If you want a place in his life, you earn it slowly, on his terms. Julian looked down at his hands. For the first time, there was no argument ready. I didn't know how to be that man, he said quietly. I know, Lillian answered. That's why we're here. The meeting ended without agreement. No shouting, no threats. Just the final understanding that the leverage Julian once held was gone. Outside, Henry walked with Lillian toward the street. You handled that well, he said. She exhaled. I was afraid I'd feel something. Anger, satisfaction, and I felt done. And you won. Henry smiled faintly. That's freedom. That evening, Lillian cooked dinner while Ethan told her about his day. He laughed easily, unburdened by adult conflicts. She listened, fully present. Later, after Ethan fell asleep, Henry stopped by with paperwork to review. They sat at the kitchen table, the city humming softly beyond the windows. You know, Henry said carefully, when this is over, you don't have to keep fighting. Lillian looked at him. Really looked. At the man who had stood beside her without trying to own her struggle. I know, she said. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something she had to defend. It felt like something she could choose. Lillian thought the worst was behind her. That belief lasted exactly 3 weeks. It began quietly, the way real damage often does. A phone call from Ethan's preschool, asking her to come in for a routine conversation. A polite email from a parent she barely knew, asking vague questions about recent legal matters. Then, one afternoon, Henry called with a tone she hadn't heard before. They're testing you again, he said. Who? Lillian asked, though she already knew. Julian's former allies, Henry replied. Not him directly. People who benefited from his silence. The first real blow came in the form of a petition. An anonymous report had been filed with Family Services, questioning Lillian's mental fitness as a parent. It cited her past postpartum depression, long work hours, and unstable support systems. The language was clinical, precise, and cruelly familiar. Lillian read the document twice, then sat very still. They're trying to scare me, she said. Yes, Henry answered. And to create leverage. That night, Lillian didn't tell Ethan anything. She helped him with homework, cooked dinner, listened to him talk about dinosaurs and playground games. Only after he fell asleep did the fear fully surface. She had fought too hard to lose him now. The home visit was scheduled for the following week. A social worker arrived with a neutral smile and a clipboard. She inspected the apartment, asked careful questions, observed interactions. Lillian answered calmly, truthfully, refusing to shrink or over-explain. Ethan climbed into her lap halfway through, wrapping his arms around her neck. The social worker noticed. She always did. When the woman left, Lillian closed the door and leaned against it, legs shaking. This never ends, she whispered. Henry came by that evening with documents spread neatly across the table. It ends when they realize they can't move you, he said. And we're close. What if they take him? Lillian asked, the question finally escaping. Henry met her eyes. They won't. Not with the evidence we have. Evidence. School records. Pediatric evaluations. Witness statements. Years of stability built quietly, deliberately. Lillian had lived responsibly, not for appearances, but out of necessity. Now, that necessity was her shield. 2 days later, the report was dismissed. Unsubstantiated. Retaliatory. Closed. But the message was clear. They were willing to use her past against her, to weaponize motherhood itself. Julian called that night for the first time in weeks. "I didn't do this," he said quickly, voice strained. "I swear." Lillian believed him. That scared her more than if she hadn't. "I know," she replied, "but it came from your world." Julian exhaled shakily. "I never meant for it to go this far." "You did," Lillian said calmly, "when you chose silence over responsibility." She ended the call before he could respond. Later, Henry stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker. "They underestimated you," he said. "They thought pressure would make you fold." Lillian looked down the hallway toward Ethan's room, where the soft glow of a nightlight spilled under the door. "They forgot something," she said quietly. "What's that?" "I've already survived losing everything," Lillian answered. "Fear doesn't work on me anymore." And in that moment, the balance finally shifted, because the people who tried to destroy her had one fatal weakness. They still believed she was the woman they once erased. They hadn't realized she was no longer fighting to survive. She was fighting to protect what she had already won. The turning point didn't come with a threat. It came with an invitation. Henry received it first, a formal request from Whitmore Capital's Ethics Committee, asking Lillian to submit a written statement regarding historical misrepresentation and third-party retaliation. The language was dry, professional, but Henry understood what it meant. "They're cleaning house," he said, "and they want your voice on record." Lillian sat quietly, reading the email twice. 4 years ago, men like this had decided her fate without asking her a single question. Now they were asking her to speak. "What happens if I do?" she asked. Henry didn't hesitate. "Julian's protection disappears. Completely. And anyone who used him as cover goes with him. And if I don't, they'll still move forward," Henry said. "But without your story, they'll soften the landing." Lillian closed her laptop and stared out the window. The city moved below her, indifferent as ever. She thought of the anonymous report, the subtle pressure, the fear that had crept back into her home. She thought of Ethan. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Lillian sat alone at the kitchen table and began to write. She didn't dramatize anything. She didn't exaggerate. She listed dates, actions, consequences. She explained how silence had been demanded, how pressure had been applied through legal intimidation and third-party influence. She described the impact on her child without pleading. She told the truth like someone who no longer needed permission. Julian didn't know what was happening until it was too late. The call came from the board the following morning. His remaining duties were suspended pending final review. Access revoked. Representation required. The tone was final. He sat in his apartment afterward, the same one Cassandra had left behind, and realized something with dull clarity. This wasn't punishment. It was removal. He tried calling Lillian. She didn't answer. Hours later, Henry informed her the committee had acknowledged her statement. "They're moving fast," he said. "This ends now." That evening, Julian sent one last message. "I understand if you never forgive me, but I need you to know, I see it now. I see what I did." Lillian read it once. Then she put her phone down. She didn't reply. Forgiveness wasn't a requirement for closure. The following week, the decision became official. Julian Whitmore was formally separated from the firm. No press release, no scandal, just a quiet update buried in corporate filings. In their world, that was the worst ending possible. At the cafe's new location, Lillian oversaw the final setup with practiced ease. Margaret watched her move through the space with pride. "You're different," she said softly. "I'm finished," Lillian replied. "That's different." Later, Henry joined her after closing. They stood together in the empty space, surrounded by clean counters and new beginnings. "You could have destroyed him," Henry said. "You chose not to." Lillian met his eyes. "I chose to stop letting him exist in my life at all." Henry smiled, something warm and unguarded. "That takes more strength than revenge." At home, Lillian tucked Ethan into bed. He hugged her tightly. "Mom," he said sleepily. "Are we okay now?" She kissed his forehead. "Yes," she said. "We are." And for the first time since the night she'd been left alone on a cold kitchen floor, Lillian knew it was true. The war wasn't won with noise. It was ended by a woman who finally chose peace and refused to carry anyone else's guilt into her future. The second gala invitation arrived 6 months later. This time, Lillian didn't freeze when she saw the envelope. It was from a different organization, unrelated to Whitmore Capital, hosted at a smaller but elegant venue overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The cafe's new location had been invited as a featured partner. Margaret smiled when she handed it to Lillian. "You should go," she said, "not because of the past, because of who you are now." Lillian considered it quietly. Then she nodded. On the night of the event, she stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, adjusting the simple navy dress she'd chosen. No dramatic transformation, no need to prove anything. Ethan watched from the bed, swinging his legs. "You look happy," he said. She smiled at him. "I am." Henry arrived right on time. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't make a show of it. He simply smiled when she opened the door, steady and familiar. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. At the venue, the atmosphere was warm, not sharp with ambition like the last gala had been. Conversations flowed easily. People listened when others spoke. Lillian found herself relaxed, laughing without effort, moving through the room as if it belonged to her. And it did. Several people recognized her work, complimented the cafe, asked thoughtful questions. No one whispered, no one stared. She wasn't a secret here. She was respected. At one point, Lillian stepped out onto the terrace alone, breathing in the cool night air. The city stretched out below, alive and indifferent. For years, she had felt like she was standing on the edge of something she might fall from at any moment. Now she felt grounded. Henry joined her quietly, leaning against the railing. "You're different tonight," he said. She looked at him. "How?" "You're not watching the exits," he replied. Lillian laughed softly. "I didn't even realize I was doing that before." They stood in comfortable silence. Then Henry spoke again, carefully. "I never wanted to step into your life as a rescuer," he said. "You never needed one." "I know," Lillian answered. "That's why I trust you." The words settled between them, honest and unforced. Inside, the music shifted to something slower. Henry offered his hand, not assuming, just asking. Lillian took it. They moved together easily, not performing, not hiding. Just two people standing in the present. Lillian felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest, not the rush of being chosen, but the calm of choosing back. Later that night, as they walked home, Henry stopped beneath a streetlight. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. Lillian met his gaze, steady. "Go ahead." "I want a future that includes you," Henry said simply. "No pressure, no timelines, just honesty." She didn't hesitate. "I want that too." Once Ender a stubble. When Lillian returned home, Ethan was asleep, the babysitter gone. She watched him for a moment, chest rising and falling, peaceful and safe. She thought of the woman she had been 4 years ago alone, terrified, gripping a phone that would never ring again. That woman had survived. This woman had built something better. Lillian turned off the light and stood in the quiet, understanding at last that the story wasn't about what Julian lost. It was about what she had gained. Freedom, stability, love that didn't demand silence, and a future that belonged entirely to her. Julian Whitmore read the final notice alone. It arrived by certified mail, thick and formal, the kind of envelope that carried no emotion, only outcomes. He sat at the kitchen counter of his quiet apartment, the same place where Cassandra had once planned campaigns and dinners, and opened it with steady hands that didn't feel steady at all. The firm's decision was final. His partnership had been terminated. Deferred compensation, frozen pending review, non-compete enforced. Reputation clauses triggered. The language was precise, merciless, and complete. Julian leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing. There would be no comeback arc, no quiet return in another city. In his world, trust was currency, and his account was empty. Days later, the supervised visitation continued as ordered. Julian arrived early, every time. He sat in the same chair, folded his hands the same way, tried not to overwhelm the small boy who shared his face but not his history. Ethan talked about school, about his favorite dinosaur, about a drawing he had made for his mom. Julian listened. He learned quickly that listening was all he was allowed to do. When the hour ended, Ethan hugged him politely, the way children hug adults they don't quite know. "Bye," he said simply. Julian watched him leave, the door closing with a soft click that echoed louder than any courtroom gavel. That night, Julian sent Lillian one last message. I lost everything I thought mattered. I see now that none of it compares to what I gave up. Lillian read it after Ethan was asleep. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt distance. She typed a response, then erased it. Some realizations didn't need witnesses. She put the phone down and returned to the living room, where Henry was reviewing plans for the cafe's third location. Everything okay? He asked. Yes, Lillian said honestly. I just closed a door. Weeks passed. Quiet ones. Julian's name faded from conversations. The city found new stories, new men to admire. He moved through his days unnoticed now, stripped of the armor he once mistook for identity. One afternoon, he stood across the street from the cafe without going in. He watched through the window as Lillian laughed with staff, confident and grounded. He saw Ethan run up to her, wrap his arms around her waist, completely unafraid. Julian understood then what the real punishment was. Not the loss of money. Not the loss of status. But the knowledge that the life he abandoned had grown into something whole without him. Across the city, Lillian signed the lease for another location. Margaret hugged her, eyes shining with pride. You did this, she said. We did, Lillian corrected. That evening, Henry cooked dinner at her apartment while Ethan set the table with exaggerated seriousness. It felt ordinary, safe, real. After Ethan went to bed, Henry reached into his jacket pocket, then stopped himself. He smiled instead. Not yet, he said softly. Lillian smiled back, understanding. There was no rush, no fear of loss driving the moment. Outside, the city lights flickered on, indifferent to endings and beginnings alike. Julian Whitmore would live the rest of his life knowing exactly where he went wrong. And Lillian Moore would live hers knowing she had chosen herself and been rewarded with a life that no one could ever take from her again. The proposal didn't happen the way movies promised. There was no spotlight, no crowd, no dramatic pause. It happened on an ordinary Sunday morning. Lillian was standing in the kitchen, barefoot, pouring coffee while sunlight filled the apartment. Ethan sat at the table, focused on a puzzle, humming to himself. The room smelled like toast and something steady like home. Henry stood near the window, watching them with quiet contentment. Can I steal you for a second? He asked. Lillian smiled. You already live here half the time. Henry laughed softly, then grew serious. He reached into his jacket pocket, not nervously, not urgently, just deliberately. I've waited, he said, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to ask you, from a place of peace, not survival. Lillian felt her breath catch. Henry knelt not dramatically, not rushed, and held out a simple ring. Elegant, thoughtful, honest. I don't want to rescue you, he said. I don't want to replace anyone. I want to walk beside you for the rest of our lives, if you'll let me. Will you marry me? Lillian didn't cry. She laughed softly, pressed a hand to her chest, and nodded. Yes, she said. I already chose you. Ethan looked up. Why are you smiling like that? Henry turned to him. Because I'm going to be your family, if that's okay with you. Ethan considered this carefully. Then he smiled. Okay, that was enough. The wedding was small, honest, held in early fall, when the city softened just a little. Margaret walked Lillian down the aisle. Ethan stood beside Henry, proud and serious in his suit. No ghosts attended. Julian was not invited, and he was not missed. Lillian wore a simple dress, her hair loose, her face calm. When she said her vows, her voice didn't shake. She spoke of trust earned, of love that didn't demand silence, of choosing, every day, to stay. Henry listened, like a man who understood the weight of being chosen. Their life afterward wasn't perfect. It was real. Mornings were busy, work was demanding, parenting required patience and humility. But the house was full of laughter, safety, and something Lillian had once believed she wasn't allowed to have: peace. Years later, Ethan would ask about his past. Lillian would answer honestly, without bitterness. Some people leave because they're afraid, she would say. Others stay because they're brave. Julian Whitmore would fade into memory a lesson, not a wound. The true ending of the story wasn't about his downfall. It was about what Lillian gained. A family that chose her. A love that honored her. A life built not on survival, but on worth. On a quiet evening, as Lillian watched Henry and Ethan laugh over a board game, she realized the truth. She hadn't been rewarded for her suffering. She had simply refused to settle for less than she deserved. And that refusal changed everything. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us right now, that tells me something important. It means something in this story touched you, maybe a memory, maybe a fear, maybe a quiet hope you haven't said out loud. What Lillian's journey really teaches us is this: life doesn't reward us because we suffer. It changes when we stop abandoning ourselves. As the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Lillian couldn't control betrayal, loss, or silence, but she could control her response. And that changed everything. Another Stoic idea reminds us that character is revealed not when life is easy, but when it is unfair. Healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means building a life so full, so grounded, that the pain no longer defines you. Lillian didn't win because someone else fell. She won because she chose truth, boundaries, and self-respect. If this story spoke to you, maybe it's because you're carrying something too. And maybe today is the day you decide not to run from it anymore. If you felt seen, comforted, or strengthened by this story, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to our channel. Your presence here matters more than you know.